Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And in fact, the first show of the week because I had a day off yesterday. But there's two shows on Friday to make up for it. Anyway, a remarkable recent show saw Jamie sharing his grandfather's epic journey from Poland via Iran, Italy, and Normandy to Wales. An equally dramatic tale is that of my guest today's father. Major Leslie Young's war included France, Norway, North Africa, and a dramatic escape in Italy. Here's the book. The links to purchasing the book are in the description below, or you can find it at your favorite bookstore. But anyway, welcome, Sir Nicholas Young. So good evening, sir. How are you today?
Hello, Paul. I'm fine. And thanks very much for having me on your show. It's a fascinating show that you put on. And I'm really, really proud and delighted to be on it. Thank you.
Well, I'm really glad you're here. We met, of course, at Ed O'Sullivan's fantastic conference back early in the year. So we were just chatting before going live, is that your father's story, I just said there, it's fairly epic, isn't it? But it isn't something that you kind of grew up understanding fully, because your father seemed to be in that broad category of don't really talk about it, which is something we've had so many times on his channel. So just explain to us how you discovered the extent of what your father got up to in World War II.
Well, yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, he was of that generation, really, who didn't really talk about the war. I was dimly aware that he'd been at Dunkirk. I was dimly aware about the Italian story, but I really knew very little else until 2 days after he died. He died in April 1986, and in his bedside cabinet, I discovered a little notebook, which was absolutely crammed full of almost illegible pencil scribbles, tiny, tiny writing. And, you know, after I'd sort of skimmed it a bit and looked at it, it was sort of clear it was a diary of some sort. And it wasn't really till some time later that I sat down and tried to work out what it was all about. And it turned out to be his diary when he was a prisoner of war in Italy, and then his 6 months on the run after the Italian armistice in September 1943. And this was a stunning discovery to me, because, as I say, he never really talked about it. It was hard to understand it because there were no names in it. There were no place names, no people's names in it. And I realized that was obviously because he didn't want, if he had been captured while he was on the run, he didn't want to be giving away the Italians who'd helped him. So it was all a bit hard to grasp. And yeah, I would probably have struggled with it for quite a lot longer had it not been for the fact that quite by chance, I got out of our local library a book by the famous travel writer Eric Newby called Love and War in the Apennines. And I started reading this book, and one or two of the things he said, the stories he recounted, sounded familiar. So I went back to my transcription of my father's diary and realized they must have been in the same prison camp. So I got in touch with Eric Newby. He said, yes, I remember your father very well, and, you know, we must get together. And it sort of flowed from there. And then having worked out the whole Italian story and worked out where he went and how he went and all the rest of it, and bearing in mind, you know, he was dead, I then thought, well, what did he do during the rest of the war? So I wrote off to the MOD, and they very kindly sent me his sort of military CV. And then I took myself off to the National Archive at Kew, where they were incredibly helpful and really helped me get into the detail and look at the war diaries for each of the campaigns he fought in. And yeah, I mean, eventually I'd got a pile of paper this tall, and I thought, well, I don't know, what I've really done this for is A, for myself to find out what it was all about, and B, to have a story to tell my kids, his grandchildren. And I thought, well, they're never going to read all this paper. I better start writing. So I ended up writing a book about it.
And that's what we'll be discussing. Although, folks, we may end up coming back and inviting Nick back to do a prequel and a sequel, because to do the entire war would take us a ridiculous amount of time, because it was an extraordinary career. And I think one of the things I really enjoyed about the book is the fact he had a foot in so many different parts of the, so to speak, because he's sort of got that territorial regiment thing, the chumminess, that kind of slightly posh boys together, but then he's with the Commandos, where it's a very different set of things. Then there's the various POW camp experiences where you're meeting other strata of people, and I think that clearly influenced him as you read the book, and it influenced how he perceived things, because he did sort of swan-like kind of move from field to field, quite literally when we get to Italy, moving from field to field. So let's go back to the beginning, because there's a pre-war element, but we'll kind of skirt through that fairly quickly and get to Dunkirk. But tell us how your father ended up in the army and his initial escapades.
Well, he signed up as a sort of territorial volunteer as soon as he left school in 1929, and he had sort of 10 years, I assume, of attending training camps and all the rest of it. Then as soon as the war started, he was right there, volunteered straight away, was accepted straight away, and was sent off to join the Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire Regiment, he was down in Kent for a while. And then they set off in 20th September 1939 to Cherbourg as part of the British Expeditionary Force, where he spent, well, as they all did in the phony war, sort of quite a few months just sort of stooging about, not really doing very much.
Moving about, digging holes, digging more holes, moving about again.
Lots of trenches, lots of wire. They went and had a look at the Maginot Line, which of course everybody assumed was going to hold and keep the Germans away. He had an early brush though with death during this period. A terrible incident on a training course in Bethune, where one of the instructors decided to demonstrate how you could very safely jump up and down on a mine, a certain type of mine, and nothing would happen. And in fact, he blew himself up, and about 13 of the people in a group that my father had actually been in, but had left because he wanted to talk to one of his chums in the group that came later. So, he saw very early on death, and that obviously shocked him a lot, because these were guys he'd been training with. They were his friends. But then they had their stint in the Maginot Line, and then they blew up some bridges before Belgium capitulated, and the retreat began.
Yeah, and what I liked about it is that he's doing those various different parts of that summer and winter and spring. He's doing that, you say, stooging about, and then he's part of because there's the people that went straight to the beach to wage evacuation, and there's sort of the various rear guard elements, and he's part of both of those things. He's both part of defending bits, but also falling back himself. And also what's good about the fact that he was an officer is he is to some extent aware of what's going on around him, whereas in the sense of what the orders are, in some of the classic accounts of people who are privates and corporals, they don't really know what the plan is and what the overall concept is. But your father did at least have a grasp of the futility of some of it, and also the desperate bravery that is required. So but we get as far as Dunkirk, and do you want to tell briefly the story of his own evacuation?
Oh, I think you're right. He was well trained, and he took it all very seriously. I mean, he was a stickler for discipline, was my father, and doing things by the book. But I think one can't underestimate the huge shock it must have been to all of them, officers down. There they were, in with the BEF, just assuming that this was, they were going to hold fast, and then all of a sudden they're in headlong retreat. And yes, you're right. He set off. His regiment set off back towards the beach, but then they were slotted into the perimeter line at Fern and had to spend a couple of days there, probably not really knowing whether they were actually going to get to the beach or whether they're going to be required to hold the perimeter for much longer. But they did in fact eventually get down to the beach on about the 1st of June, and they spent a fair amount of time just trying to work out how they were going to get on a boat, because I must say I found writing about Dunkirk the most difficult part of the job. you know, we've seen the somewhat romanticized films, but when you really start to get into the war diaries and the detailed descriptions that people have written about what it was really like on the beaches, and then you put your own father into the middle of that, it's pretty sobering. And I found it very hard to write about that. But yeah, eventually he found his way onto the East Mole, and there was a sort of fishing boat called the Ben-My-Cree waiting there. He goes on board and discovers several of his regimental colleagues on board already. One of them produces a crate of beer from down in the hold, and they set off back to Folkestone. But I mean, it was one of the last boats. There it is, one of the last boats out of Dunkirk.
And the thing that I found really fascinating, I keep saying the same words, is that he must have gone into there with this understanding of he's part of the structure of the British Army. He's a territorial. This is the army that had been the most professional army in the world in 1918. Okay, he wasn't there then, but he's definitely part of that sense of professionalism. And we've done this before. And Dunkirk was, you know, like having the rug pulled out from under your feet, and you know, let's not dress it up. Despite the heroism of the evacuation, it was a defeat. And then he's back into England there, and you know, regiments have disappeared, regiments have been left behind, entire units have been left behind, and it must have been a real shock to the system of just how quickly the organization that he'd been part of for so long had been, well, routed. Yeah. I suppose is the word.
Yes, I mean, deeply demoralizing and shocking in every way, I'm sure. And of course, you know, he'd lost people. He'd lost people in his company, in his regiment, and didn't really know what the world. They didn't know at all when they got back. Well, they didn't know if they were going to get back, and then when they got back, they really didn't know what was going to happen next, because they'd had to leave. They destroyed all their weapons and vehicles on the way down to the beaches. You know, they had their uniform, and that was about it, and no real sense of what was going to happen next to them.
But there's this new thing. There's this new concept of commandos and striking back and Churchill's call to arms, etc., etc. And within a fairly short space of time, he's off to the Lofoten Islands. And again, one of the things, you know, I really enjoyed about the book is the fact you didn't just, you know, you mentioned the going to Kew, you mentioned getting all the diaries, getting the service records, but you basically, where possible, you retraced his very route yourself by going to the same places and doing the same things he did. Was that something you decided to do at the very beginning of this process, or was it sort of as you started putting things together, you think, oh, you know what, I feel I need to walk the ground?
Well, absolutely. I mean, as soon as I started, I realized that I wanted to be with my father through these experiences as far as I could, and B, I realized that to understand what was happening, I really needed to see it. I needed to see what those beaches were like. You know, I had to understand what it might have felt like. I was very lucky. I went back with a guy who took a party from my father's regiment, who had been a subaltern in my father's company. So younger than Dad. Dad was sort of 28 when war broke out, so he was already relatively old. And you know, this guy literally took us through every footstep of what they had done. And I mean, I will never forget him. He stood on the beach at Dunkirk with his back to the sea, and he started describing what it was like. And then he just stopped. And the wind was sort of ruffling his white hair. And you could just see he was miles away, just lost in his thoughts. And it was it was incredibly moving. I went with my youngest son on that trip. And yes, I mean, I followed Dad's footsteps absolutely everywhere. I've got one trip to do still, which is the trip from Lisieux in eastern France through to the German border.
Okay,
I haven't done yet, and I'm doing.
Well, that's only about an hour and a half away from me to start. That's
it's a long way. We've got to get there yet, but
we can meet. I'm
doing that in September with my eldest.
The Lofoten Islands, and again, this is we know we're not going to go into much detail there because it's a story that we will be covering, in fact, later on in our Norway series. But there he is, part of the Commandos now. So, so basically, what do you think his motivation was for the command? Because we have this sort of cliched idea that's based on truth. In 1940, it's not what you know, it's who you know. All these fledgling units, it's people who know each other from the social scene or the polo clubs or the cricket club. I know Major so-and-so would be good for that. Lieutenant so-and-so. Is that sort of what happens? I'm asking for your viewers' benefit rather than mine in your father's case.
No. I mean, he was just a cold volunteer. He was horrified at what had happened. I remember my dad, he was always determined to right wrongs wherever he could. He felt a wrong had been done and he wanted to do what he could to put it right. So he volunteered. He was interviewed by Colonel Percy Lagarde for 4 Commando, was given a troop and said, right, young, go away and recruit your men. So there was an extraordinary account of him holed up in a hotel, sort of Winchester or Dorchester, I think it was, recruiting men. He got a daredevil motorcycle rider, the Wall of Death rider. He got a poacher. He got all sorts of a really weird and wonderful assortment of people who he felt would stick it to the enemy if they got the chance. And that was his motivation.
Yeah, and that's why I asked you the question, because it does seem a lot of people who ended up in those early units did it on a whim. They didn't really know what they were doing.
No, it was new. It was brand new. Never been done.
Your father, it's absolute no. There's a revenge. Not revenge is quite a strong word, but there's a real sense of no. We need to take this war back to them. What can I do right now? And he goes off to a number 4 Commando, which would have been a very different experience from the I'm using the word regimented in its very literal sense there, word of the beds and hearts, particularly post-war, pre-war in the territorials, because the Commandos, you said there, was a very, very different type of force. Do you think he changed his leadership attitudes and his style when he went to Commandos? Because, as you said, he got it. The discipline is obviously key there, but you said that he had this disparate group of people in his troop there. Do you think he changed the way he acted as a leader?
Well, yeah, he did. I mean, for a start, he accepted a drop in rank. He went down from major to captain because that's what he had to do to get into the Commandos. And he was known in the Commandos as the Mad Major. One of the guys who fought with him said, "Oh, your father, he was absolutely bonkers. He'd never go across a bridge if he could possibly make us swim across a river." And, he trained hard. They trained to live off the land. They trained to kill, of course.
Yeah.
Particularly up in Scotland, he learned those skills. It was clear that they were going to be making landings by boat. So they did a lot of training at sea, down at Weymouth, a lot of swimming. And it was a lot of very hard training, as I say, down there and then up in Scotland before eventually they set sail for Norway.
And let's be honest, he wasn't the very youngest. He wasn't a 21-year-old. He was, what was he, 30?
Well, he would have been 29 by this stage.
29.
Yeah.
So, not that's old, but at the time, when you're with these incredibly...
Well, 19, 20, that sort of age. Yeah.
So, we'll kind of, if you want to tell briefly what his role was in Lofoten now, we can do that. But I'm conscious of the time and moving through to the meat of this story there. But the one things I definitely want to ask you is, when you're there in Norway, there's definite things to see. You were seeing quaysides and buildings and jetties and things. Whereas when we get to Tunisia, it's barren hillsides in the arse end of nowhere. So Lofoten, what was it like when you went there, and kind of retracing what your father did, and explain to us what he did?
Okay, so his commando was deputed to, or his troop was deputed to invade this island, which is the island of Stora Mulla. And what you see in the picture is a little town called Brettersness. And that's where a lot of fish oil tanks were stored. And the task of this, the point of this whole operation, apart from being a bit of a sort of propaganda coup for Churchill, showing that we were hitting straight back at the enemy, we weren't sitting on our backsides. Part of the point of it was to destroy all the fish oil tanks on the Lofoten Islands. I mean, the Lofoten Islands are cod. That's
Yep.
what they are about. And if you go there today, the place is full of wooden A-frames with cod hanging to dry on it. And the oil was being used by the Germans to partly to make explosives and partly for lubricating their armaments. So, you know, it was a pretty useful thing to do to destroy the hundreds of fish oil tanks that were on the Lofoten Islands. They captured a lot of Germans. They brought back with them a lot of Norwegian volunteers for the Norwegian army in exile. And they brought back an Enigma machine, which was one of the first Enigma machines to brought back. And of course, that we all know the story of Enigma and how fantastically important those discoveries were.
Yeah, I mean, it's folks. We're going to have Jane Galliford-Lowes sometime later in the year talking about Lofoten Islands, and we'll be talking about Norwegian volunteers in the British Army as well. So all coming up on World War II TV. Click like and subscribe. But moving along very fast because we need to get to it. Tunisia, of course, is where your father ends up getting captured. One of the things I liked about your retelling of the Tunisia campaign is how fair you were to some of the command decisions made by the brigade, by people around, because Tunisia campaign was a real highs and lows for the British Army. Some things went really, really well, and some things didn't go well, as both the Allies and the Germans are sort of working out their tactics, getting their doctrine right, getting things out. And you know, your father experiences sort of all sides of that in Tunisia, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. I mean, he arrives in Tunisia with the tail end, I suppose, of Operation Torch, relatively late, and straight into Tunisia. He lands at Algiers, straight to Tunisia, marches east in Tunisia, and his company is tasked with capturing this rocky hill 583. So he starts to plan for that. Then he's told he's got to, at the same time, tackle another couple of hills a bit further on. He's given radios that don't work. He's given something like 10 hand grenades, and there's nowhere near enough ammunition for his men. But he does capture a hill 583. I mean, it's as barren as it looks there. That sort of rocky bit in the background, not the grassy bit in the foreground. There's absolutely no cover, but he held it overnight. And then first thing the next morning, the Hermann Goering division attacked again. And within a few hours, very quickly, killed a lot of people and overran the hilltop. My father and his sort of small headquarters team were overrun and were forced to surrender. And he never talked about that. I never knew about this until I researched it in the war diaries. I think he felt absolutely dreadful about that, about, you know, having to surrender when a lot of his men had been killed, him still being alive, you know, survivor's guilt.
Yeah.
And that awful feeling of defeat. You know, he'd been given a task and he felt that he'd failed at it. And I know that sense of failure stayed with him throughout his life, because I think, as I describe in the book, Paul, I found some correspondence between him and his second in command years later, in sort of early 1982, 1983, where they'd met up at a reunion. My father never went to reunions. He went to that one. He met up with Tom LaFontaine, his second in command. And then he had clearly written to Tom after the reunion to say, did I get it wrong? Did I really mess up? And Tom writes this one, which I've got, this wonderful letter back saying, Leslie, don't be ridiculous. We're given an absolutely impossible target. Nobody can hold. It's a razorback. Nobody can hold a razorback, as you well know. No, you fought your damnedest, and nobody has ever blamed you in my hearing, and nobody ever could. So it was wonderful for me to see that letter, but it made me realize just, you know, these things that happen to guys in war stay with them the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
They just move on. these are terrible events. And I mean, I found that hill and had an amazing guide who helped us track it down. It wasn't at all easy to find. And we found the graves of all the men from his company who died there. And yeah, that was a pretty extraordinary experience.
And as we said earlier, without you having stood there yourself on that hill,
Oh.
I don't think you'd have been able to do what you did with the book and bring it together and make sense of it as a human experience as well as a military and strategic one. And that's what your book does, is that you try to, you don't ever second guess your father. You don't put thoughts or ideas that aren't there, but what you do is you do your interpretation of them from your point of view as a son, which I appreciated kind of honesty there. And this is an odd, because the Tunisia campaign will end with a victory, but he, yes, alas, is not part of it. And so this begins for us the next chapter, and then there's the Red Cross capture record, and then off to Italy. And your father, from your writing, he obviously, you said there's some survivor's guilt of surviving the battle, but he seems to take on the POW life as a different challenge, and a new set of problems to face. So take us through the next few stages.
Okay, well, he is taken across the Med in an Italian troop ship. Initially, they're put in the hold, but my father wasn't having any of that and fought a campaign on behalf of his men to be allowed to travel on deck, which they were. They got across the Med. Of course, as we know, there were ships that didn't get across the Med because they were sunk by the Allies. But he got across. He was landed at Naples, was taken to a sort of interim camp at Capua, and then ended up at a camp in northern Italy, PG. That's Prigionieri di Guerra, PG 49 at Fontanellato near Parma. And I mean, there it is today on the screen. It looks pretty ritzy, and indeed it was. It was
as camps go. I've seen a lot worse, Nick.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it was a brand new orphanage that had only been built in 1939. It was never used as an orphanage, and soon after the war started, the Italians made an agreement with the Germans. Anyone captured in North Africa will be sent to prison camp in Italy. And the Italians knocked up something like 82 POW camps all over the country. And this one was it was a bit of a presentation camp. It was for officers only. There were 500 officers with 600 sort of other rank servants, really. And it was a bit of a show camp, I think, to enable the Italians to show to the Red Cross, that was, of course, tasked with inspecting all these camps, to show how wonderfully the Italians looked after their prisoners. They did look after the officers in Fontanellato pretty well. I mean, there was a bar, they got their Red Cross parcels, there was post, there was lots of football, all sorts of gambling games going on. I mean, Eric Newby tells the story very well of the fun and games that went on in Fontanellato camp. But the conditions in many of the other camps in Italy were nowhere near as good. Of course, officers couldn't be forced to work, which was a big difference. So they had, plenty of time on their hands for coming up with escape plans and generally ragging the Italians at every opportunity they got.
I realized we didn't address how he ended up back in the regiment. Ian T asked about the exit from the Commandos. So basically, they wanted him back, didn't they?
Yeah, the regiment wanted him back, and the guy who had taken over the Commandos from Lagarde was a fellow called Lister, who, it's fairly clear from one or two comments that I've got, that Lister was regarded as a bit of a nutcase, and so Dad was a bit nervous about serving with him. A, B, there were no plans after that Lofoten Island raid for the Commandos to do anything else.
Yeah.
It's just, as far as they all knew, they were going back up to Scotland to do some more training and hang around waiting for another operation. Whereas Dad's understanding was that his regiment, the Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire Regiment, was going to be sent back to Africa pretty quickly. And that's where he wanted to be. He wanted to be back in the fight. So he went back as adjutant in the regiment. In fact, they weren't sent back to Africa for another good few months, until not until 1943. So he dipped out a bit there, but yeah, there we go.
Well, I mean, in order to encourage people to buy the book, because there are lots of anecdotes about just POW camp life, and you say you use the other books of other people who are in similar experiences. But for me, the key part that it reminded me of is that there is this. Everyone knows that at some point the Allied invasion on the coast is going to be heading inland, and there are these various camps of Allied prisoners dotted around Italy. What should they do? What will the Italians do if the war ends? From their point of view, what will the Germans do? And without going to lots of rabbit hole details about that, that's a situation that every camp knows there's some sort of decision to make. So for those who don't understand that dilemma, kind of sum it up for us, please.
Yeah. So, the Allies invade Italy, invade Sicily. There's clear, Mussolini is sacked, Badoglio takes over. It's clear that, Italy is pretty much finished.
Yeah.
And the question for all of those in the camps becomes, what's going to happen if the Italians, surrender and back out of the war? Are these camps going to be overrun by the Germans coming down from the north, or are the Allied invading armies going to be able to move quickly enough up Italy to rescue us before the Germans come? And that was the big question. And the question was made even more difficult by the famous stay put order.
Yeah.
That was issued allegedly on Monti's instructions, that he didn't want lots of, rather desperate, untrained Allied POWs wandering around Italy, getting themselves into trouble, getting in the way of the invasion forces. So he said, you all stay put in your camps. We're going to be rushing up Italy and we're going to rescue you. And in this camp in Fontanellato and in a number of other camps, the senior British officer very quickly came to the view that order was nonsense, it was out of date, and that actually they needed to get out of that place as fast as they could before the Germans arrived. And he did a deal with the Italian camp commandant, a very brave man called Vice Domini, whereby Vice Domini cuts a hole in the wire, and the guys literally march out, all 600 of them in formation. Sadly, there's no photograph of this. Photographs were taken at the time, but the film has gone, lost. But there is this wonderful painting of these chaps still with their sort of red stars on the prisoner stars on their backs, marching out of the camp. 2 miles away, they camp out in a sort of dried up stream bed called the Bund and work out what the hell they're going to do next. Local Italians come and give them food and wine, of course, and clothing so they can start to disguise themselves. And for about 3 or 4 days, well, what are we going to do? Are we going north over to Switzerland, over the Alps? Are we going east and west, try and pick up a boat? Or are we going to head south towards the Allied lines? And my father chummed up with an RAF pilot called Dickinson, and they decided to head south. There he is, there's Reg Dickinson. They decided to head south. My father wearing a pair of Italian trousers that came down to just below his knees, and described by a friend of his as looking for all the world like an Englishman trying to disguise himself as an Italian. He spoke no Italian. He was on his own with Reg, heading south, hoping somehow to meet up with the Allied forces advancing northwards.
And we had the chat before going live about, it seemed that there are lots of people doing similar things. There's SAS guys moving around in Italy, having escaped from things. But it seems that your father very early on decides that he can't do this on his own. You say he doesn't speak Italian, but going and just chatting to the Italian locals is inherently risky. I mean, every time we do a show about any of the occupied countries, or indeed countries like Italy, there are the people that are pro-Allied, anti-Allied, collaborationists, opportunists, people who don't want to get involved because of sheer fear. And some escapers ended up just literally living on their own, never speaking to anyone, moving at night. Your father seems to say, okay, no, I can't do this on my own. Do you think that was an attitude he was sort of born with, or do you think that was because of the experience of the Italians bringing clothing? Do you think it was out of necessity? Do you have a kind of a reason why he went down that route?
Well, he's a sort of public school boy. He's used to playing in teams and all of that. I think he clearly recognized his shortcomings in terms of Italian. I mean, yeah, he had no ear for foreign languages at all throughout his life. He was quite a gregarious sort of guy at this stage. I think he just wanted a bit of company. And he chummed up with Reg. They turned out not to get on so well, actually. Reg was great with the Italian women and made girlfriends wherever he went, and tended to want to sort of stick around with the girls rather than head on, to get back to fight. That was what my father was motivating my father. So they did eventually, about halfway down, they did split up. But this is it. So here's a typical Italian village. This is the village of Banzola. It's the first place my father came to after he got out of the camp. And the way they went about it, and this pertained to all 48 little hamlets he stayed in the Apennine Mountains during his 6 months on the run. They looked for the poorest place. They looked for the most run-down, poorest sharecropper cottage, because they felt that, the poorer Italians would be the ones who would help them. They would probably have very little themselves, but that they would feel that sense of sympathy and empathy with escaping prisoners on the run, and that turned out to be the case. Here's that. Just going back to the map there, Paul.
Yep, no worries.
So there's the first few months of the route. This is all in the Apennine Mountains. They very quickly decided they weren't heading for valleys. They weren't heading for towns and cities. They were going to get right up into this extraordinary chain of mountains that is effectively Italy's backbone, Italy's spine, called the Apennines. And they stayed up at that high level, knocking on the doors of basically sharecropper farmers. In other words, farmers who had to give half of what they grew to the landlord as rent, and they were allowed to keep what was left. They had very little money, these people. They were incredibly poverty stricken, but they were very generous to my father and to many, many thousands of other guys who had got out when they had the chance before the Germans came in.
And that's something we're going to expand on as we get through the show there, because living in Normandy as I do, the links between the Allied countries that fought here and the locals are obvious to the thousands, well, tens of thousands of people who come here every week. But perhaps people are less aware of the relationship between Allied escaping prisoners of war and units that passed through with the Italians, because, of course, the Italians had started as one of the Axis. I think perhaps there's a perception difference in the members of the public. And I love the fact that you are part, and we'll talk about this later, this trust of getting these relationships between Britain and Italy and these various nations, because it's important to remember not just your father's bravery, which goes without question, but the incredible bravery of these people that are helping him along the way. But
they were risking their lives, Paul. There was a price.
At the end of the day, if your father gets captured, more than likely he's back in a truck and he gets taken to the camp, and it's back behind wire. But there were cases of things happening on a more severe level than that, but that was against the normal way. Where, as you say, if you're helping out and the SS find out an Italian person has helped a prisoner, well, we all know what the outcome could be.
Oh, I mean, almost certain death. Often whole villages were wiped out for helping Allied prisoners escape. You'd certainly lose all your property. Of course, your family was at risk. Yeah, you risk losing everything, literally.
Yeah.
They were very brave. I mean, 48 little hamlets. Somebody in those 48 hamlets took my father and who he was traveling with in, fed them, gave them a bed for the night, lent them a map, maybe gave them some more clothing, and then sent them on their way, risking their lives in the process. I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for those Italians.
Indeed. Which town are we looking at now?
Oh, this is a wonderful, the town. I mean, it's a village, and that's
Yeah.
pretty much the village that
It.
you see there. And in so many, I've followed my father's footsteps literally on this journey. I've been to every single one of those hamlets. And in some of them, because of the little diary that my father had kept, I was able to absolutely point to a barn or a room and say, my father slept in that barn. And in this little place, there was a party going on. All the local Italian girls wanted to come and have a look at the two POWs who turned up one night. They were taken off to the sort of local pub to drink. Then they came back and the party really got going just in the barn at the back of this picture here. And at the end of the evening, so the girls left. And my father describes hearing them singing Ave Maria at a shrine on the corner. And that shrine is still there. There it is on the right-hand side in that picture. It was really just extraordinary to see that and have the diary just absolutely come to life.
Absolutely. And a change of escaping partner at this point, or around this point.
Yes. Reg and Dad fell in with a bunch of partisans right up in the mountains. They were a pretty bloodthirsty crew, these particular partisans. They just got back, with their sort of wiping the blood off their bayonets after a score settling session in a sort of nearby village. I think my father very quickly came to the view that this was not a professional military outfit, and that joining them would actually impede his journey south, which is what he really wanted to do. Reg, on the other hand, was keen to stay put for a bit, but there was a New Zealander called Charlie Gatenby who had also fallen in with these partisans. There he is. There's Charlie Gatenby, and he and Dad really, decided they had a lot in common. They just wanted to get back home and continue the fight. So they said a fond farewell to Reg, and off they went, Charlie and Leslie.
Brilliant stuff. And we've got the first of our photos of the Italian people that your father encountered, and that again is one of the aspects that I so loved about the book, is that I've read books where they just don't have names. Is that we were helped by, and sometimes it's because the author didn't know the names. He was racing through somewhere. We were helped by these two peasant fellows or something in North France. But with the details your dad provided,
they didn't have their names. They couldn't write them down, so they just couldn't remember. This is extraordinary. This is the Briganti family in a place called Vegaretto, which is about halfway down Italy. And this is a really bizarre story. So my wife and I followed in my father's footsteps, and every little village we went to where my father had been, we left a thank you letter in Italian. Thank you to the local community. Somebody here looked after my father during the war. I've just come back to express our family's gratitude. And there was an email address. And we put these notices up on church doors and in cafes, and even in one place, just here, pinned to a tree, because there weren't any buildings around. And a lady called Angelina, elderly woman, was visiting with her daughter the place where she used to live, near Vegaretto. There's a notice on a tree. That was the type of thing we did. And she was told by the people she was having lunch with that this notice had appeared. And Angelina said, oh, I really want to see that notice. So she got her daughter to take her to this notice. And she took one look at it and said, oh, that's the man. That's the man. And she was absolutely certain that the picture that I'd put on the letter of my father was the picture of a man who had come to her sharecropper father's hut in one night in October 1943, desperately seeking help. He was on his own. He was frozen. He was wet. And he needed a bed somewhere to sleep for the night and something to eat. And the daughter wrote and told me this story. She said, it's probably my mother imagining things, Mr. Young, but I thought you'd like to hear it. And I thought that was the case, because I thought, well, hang on, Dad wasn't on his own. He was always with either Reg or Charlie. But then I went back to the diary, and blow me, on one night in early October 1943, near this place, Vegaretto, the two of them had got separated, crossing a road, which was sort of full of German troops, and they'd got separated. And my father spent clearly a night on his own. And so we head back to meet Angelina. There she is. And all the way through our meeting, which was sort of most of an afternoon, she sat close to me like that, sort of holding my arm. And every so often she would turn to her daughter and say, "He's come back. He's come back. Leslie has come back." What can you say?
Yeah. And your determination to also find out about their experiences comes through as well, because people are mentioning in the sidebar, that's the kind of part of Italy where not just the current war, but there's memories of First World War casualties as well. Then you got the whole Mussolini era. There's the bombing of Italy that we don't talk about enough.
Absolutely.
What were the attitude of the people you met who had lived through that time, regardless of whether or not they met your father personally? What was their attitude about that period, that in-between period of the war Italy are about to be out of the war, but what was it like for the people there then? What were their attitude?
Well, not many people, not nearly enough people in Italy know and understand this story, actually.
Yeah.
It's not well publicized. It's not written about. I mean, these are poor sharecropper families, many of them relatively illiterate. They're not going to write books about the experiences in the way that, officers like my father wrote books about his escape experiences. So I think that's the first thing to say. Secondly, the war is still an ambiguous part of the Italian story, because, of course, in Italy, as in France, as in any country that has ever been occupied, and as would have been the case in Britain if we had been occupied, some people felt they had to collaborate and some people felt they had to resist. And, people still remember whose family collaborated, whose family was a fascist and whose family wasn't. So this sort of story, gets caught up in that and doesn't get talked about a lot. But no, I mean, when talking to Angelina and one or two of the other families who helped my father, they do feel very proud of it. They had no great love for Mussolini. Often it was the mother of the family, whose son was probably in the Italian army, might even be in a prison camp in Italy, whose mother said, "Oh, I hope they're treating Giovanni well. We've got to treat, this boy well too." It's a sort of give and take of war. They're just ordinary, really lovely, generous, ordinary people who want to who see a need to help those poorer than themselves. This is another couple. So we're coming towards the end of the actual escape now. We're down in a village called Covaro in the Abruzzi Mountains, about 70 miles northeast of Rome. It's snowing. It's November by now. And my father has pneumonia. Both of them have walked through their boots, so they're almost walking barefoot. And they show up in this little village called Covaro. There's a little shop that's still open, run by the woman here, Bernardina de Michaelis. And she says, "Well, you come in and have a cup of tea. My husband will be back soon." The husband, Pepe, there he is on the left, he comes back. They have a discussion and they decide to hide Charlie and my father in the basement for a little while my father gets better from pneumonia. They summon the local doctor, and that's where they stay for about a month, in this basement. There's a German garrison 100 yards up the road. But, they've still prepared to take this risk. And then as the winter goes on, that's the little shop, actually. There it is. Yeah. That shop is still there today. And they take them up the mountain to a little casale. I suppose we'd call it a sort of a homestead. It's a little sort of place where the cattle live, and there's a sort of stone hut and a bit of hay. There it is. And my father and Charlie and a couple of other POWs are hidden in this little sort of stone hut at the back of the casale, at the back of the homestead. And every day, Pepe, that elderly gentleman we saw, comes up with a horse and cart through the snow. There's 8 feet of snow, winds his way up the mountain with some food and something hot for the 4 POWs who are living there. And he brings with him his son, who's a 5-year-old boy. And I met that man. He's sadly dead now. But that 5-year-old boy absolutely remembered my father. He remembered sitting on my father's lap during a bombing raid. You talked about the bombing raids. He remembered sitting on my father's lap in the cellar, frightened out of his wits, and how wonderful my father was because he fed him peppermints all the way through the bombing raid. And that sort of comforted the boy. That struck home because all his life, my father had a packet of Murray mints or Polos in his pocket. He always had peppermints about him. And there he was again. There all of a sudden, there he was in this basement in this little village called Cavaro. Yeah, they stayed there for about a month over Christmas. And they then were introduced to 2 young Jewish Italians, Eugenio and Silvia Elfa. Eugenio was a law student. He was 23, and his sister Silvia was 19. There they are, rock climbing. They were quite a sporty couple. They used to. Their father was a wealthy fur trader, Jewish fur trader in Rome. They'd lived the sort of, the good life, I suppose, in Rome. Skiing in the winter and swimming in the summer. But of course, once the Germans overran Italy, all Jews knew that they were no longer as safe as they had been. I mean, not that they'd been particularly safe under Mussolini. Life was very tough for Jews under Mussolini, but they faced death with the Germans, of course. So the Elfa family, mother, father, and these 2 kids, came up into the mountains where they were hiding out too, like the POWs. And the 2 kids joined up with a local partisan band, the Joda partisan band, and they agreed to help Allied escapers find their way to the Allied lines in the south. My father was introduced to them, and they agreed to help him and Charlie get back to their units. And kind of they were having these discussions about how to do that when news came through that the Allies had landed at Anzio on the 20th of January 1943. So Doc, the boy Eugenio, immediately said, right, we know the way to Anzio, we will guide you there. And there we are. You can see Cavaro about halfway up this map, just under L'Aquila. And they had a 5 or 6 day journey, 8 foot of snow on the ground, through the Abruzzi Mountains to get down to Anzio, which is sort of on a plain just below Rome. There's a lot of marshland around there, the Pontine marshes, which the Germans had flooded. And this is a really extraordinary part of this story, Paul, because what was going on at this point was an absolute pitched battle between the Allies clinging on to their beachhead just south of Rome at Anzio, and the Germans, increasing numbers, like up to 70 or 80,000 Germans rushing south to push them back into the sea. So you can imagine all hell has let loose around Anzio.
And I'd never, until I read your book, Nick, I hadn't. Because when I'm thinking of Anzio, I'm not thinking of escaping prisoners of war. I'm thinking of Anzio as its beachhead, what's going on there, leadership decisions, the famous quote, I wanted a lion and got a pussycat, whatever it was he said.
Yes,
so I've never thought about it. I've never thought about it in that point of view of the fact that there are these, at this point, who knows how many escaping POWs there are coming down through Italy, trying to get out there. Some have gone north, some have gone south, as you said there, but I'd never kind of connected those two together. And then you bring in the element as well of Jewish people hiding, people who are hiding from the Nazis for other reasons, all coming together now in this part of the story where you've got a beachhead, escaping POWs, and Jews terrified of being captured, all culminating, which is, and this is the part of the story that I heard you relate that evening at Ed's, whenever that was back in, and it's like, I've got to get you on the show for this. That was the decision made in my head there.
Yeah, well, this is really extraordinary. So these two, young kids, 23, 19, the girl, and her, not quite sure, but let's call him her boyfriend, called Count Carlo Tevini, who was the son of a very wealthy fascist in Rome. And there's a sort of ambiguity about who Carlo really was. But anyway, he's been described to me as Sylvia's boyfriend. The three of them, plus Dad, plus Gatenby, set off for this 5-day march. They sleep out in the rough or in caves. There's 8 feet of snow. They're in a convent for a night. I mean, they have a ghastly journey till they get to a town called Norma, which is on a bluff overlooking the Pontine marshes and Anzio. They do a bit of recceing, and then at sort of 2 o'clock on the morning of the 5th of February, 1944, the four of them set out to thread their way through the massed German lines. I mean, they're crowded. There's lots of troops around. They crawl literally on their hands and knees, holding onto each other's ankles through the German minefield. And just as they come out of the German minefield at this very spot, they're seen by a German patrol, which opens fire. And the boy is clearly dead. He disappears. He's been killed. Carlo is dying and, shot in the chest. He's in a terrible way. They try to move him. He can't move. And the girl wants to stay with her brother's body and with Carlo. And my father and Gateby say, look, we can't stay here. We've got to keep going. By this stage, they're about sort of 500 yards or maybe a mile from the American lines at Anzio, the perimeter of the Anzio beachhead. And eventually Sylvia, after this sort of terrifying, it must have been terrifying. The Germans were still looking for them. There's bullets and rockets and God knows what going off all the time. They decide to carry on. And so they sort of carry on crawling through no man's land until 5-6 o'clock. It's dawn, and an American patrol sees these shadowy figures in no man's land. This is a patrol called the 1st Special Service Force. It's a troop of crack Canadian soldiers put together with a gang of American hoodlums, basically. They're called the Devil's Brigade. They're a bloodthirsty lot, and if ever there was a unit that was going to shoot first and ask questions later, it was the Devil's Brigade, because they opened fire immediately. Charlie, the New Zealander, is hit in the shoulder. Sylvia is hit in the throat, and my father, who's managed to scramble into a ditch, is shouting and screaming at the Americans to stop firing, which eventually they do, and he carries Sylvia's body to the American Jeep. They take her to the field hospital on the beach at Anzio, and she dies that night. So, the 3 Italians who helped my father and Gatenby escape, 2 of them are dead. One of them, as it turns out, isn't dead. Carlo is not dead. He's captured by the Germans and then is eventually released when Rome falls. All sorts of mysteries around that. But the brother and sister are dead. And my father's first job back in uniform is to arrange her funeral at the American War Cemetery in Anzio. And then he's on a ship from Naples back to Britain.
And I mean, thank you for sharing that story with us, and obviously there's more details in the books, folks. But you know, your father is already dealing with Dunkirk, Tunisia, and being captured, the loss of his friends, being a prisoner of war, pneumonia, all that, and then the people who are helping to him to escape are killed doing it, and yet when we would talk about in these days in 2025, you'd need time to process that. You know, if he was at work, he'd be given some kind of leave to sort of go and get processed
counseling, all of that. Yeah.
But I mean, and we're going to have, we know that's why we're going to probably bring you back for Suga, because we've still got Normandy and the Great Swan to go. It's not like he had any time to deal with this. And so, I mean, just an absolutely extraordinary story. And you can understand why your father didn't talk about it very much, because where do you start? What do you say? What do you not say? How much do you admit? Do you want to explain to your children that, you know, do you want to break down in front of your children when you're raising your, you know, he's raising you and
my sister?
Your dad was obviously carrying that around.
He was.
For a long time.
Never mentioned it. Never, ever, ever mentioned it. Never went back. Was in contact with the Elfer family. He sent them money. And there is just an extraordinary coda to the story, Paul, is that the mother, we'll come back to this family in a minute, the mother, Liza Elfer, goes back to Anzio after the war, and she finds her daughter's body in the American War Cemetery, and she brings it back to Rome to be buried in the Jewish cemetery in Rome. A year and a half later, she is sent an article from an Anzio newspaper, which refers to a body that's been found in a ditch nearby. And she conceives the idea that this body is her son's. She writes to my father. I've got the telegram. She writes to my father asking what Eugenio was wearing when he died. And my father gives a description of what he was wearing. And armed with that, she persuades the British forces, who were obviously still around in Italy, to help her exhume the body. She identifies it as her son, and she brings his body back to be buried with his sister and her husband, Liza's husband, who has also died, it's said, of a broken heart at around the same time. And the three of them were buried in the same plot in the Jewish war cemetery, monumental war cemetery. And Liza, the mother, goes on to live alone, visiting that grave every week to the age of 105. She died 5 years, but just 5 years before I was able to track and work this whole story out and go to Rome and find that grave. And when I got to the grave, I realized that if I'd only started 5 years earlier, I might actually have met her. And every time my wife and I go to Rome, we go quite a bit. We always go and spend some time in that cemetery with that extraordinary family.
Well, you made that segue for me yourself there, you know, talking about you and your wife going to Italy, because I mean, it would be an amazing presentation if we just ended it right now and said, well, thank you very much, Nick. We'll see you again in the future. But the fact is, beyond the book, you are part, along with other people, of tying these countries together, creating links. So tell us about who we've got on the screen there. Then we can talk about the Monte San Martino.
So this is the wonderful De Michaelis family from Corvaro. This is the family who took my father and Charlie in, looked after them for 2 months, and then sent them on their way with the Elfers to Anzio. And this is the modern family. There are grandchildren of Bernardina and Peppino there, and great-grandchildren. And what's really lovely is that so far 3 of those children have now come to Britain, obviously to visit us as a family, but also to take up a bursary provided by the charity that until very recently I chaired. It's called the Monte San Martino Trust. And it was set up, set up in 1989 by a former POW who had also been helped by Italians. And he decided on his retirement that he was going to do something to say thank you to those families. And he set up this trust, its main objective being to bring now 40 or 45 young people from villages that helped escapers over to the UK in the summer to learn English, and we pay all their expenses. It's just our little way. We're almost all of us are the sons or daughters or nieces or nephews of escapers. And we all recognize that actually, if it hadn't been for those Italians, we wouldn't be here today. And I can say that with absolute certainty. I would not be here today if it wasn't for those Italians. And so we offer these bursaries, and they're becoming very, very popular. We've gathered together an extraordinary archive of escape and help stories, which are all on our website, Monte San Martino Trust.
The link is in the description below.
The
folks.
link is there.
It's straight there. Go there, leave a donation, look at some of the archive. It's one of those. It's a history site in itself. It's obviously a foundation. It's doing this fantastic work, but it's also an incredible resource of information. And boy, there some rabbit holes for you to follow there, viewers. Your father's story is one of many incredible stories that are hinted at there. Incredible stuff.
So yes, that's the other big thing we've got on as a trust. I mean, it's a growing organization actually, which is very exciting. Is that we discovered that after the war, a commission was set up by the Allies to offer compensation to Italians who had been injured or had suffered loss, whatever kind of loss, through helping the Allies, including escaped POWs. And this commission, it was called the Allied Screening Commission, doled out pitifully small chunks of money to those Italians who could make a claim. 60,000 Italian families did make a claim. And some of them received these sums of money, as I say. Some of them were nominated for bravery awards, King's Medals for Bravery. 400 of those were nominated by the Allied Screening Commission. Tragically, shamefully, really, none of those medals were ever actually awarded. The Churchill government at the end of the war decided that the British public wouldn't really stand for citizens of former enemy country getting a King's Medal. The Americans didn't take that view. They did, they did award bravery medals to Italians, but we never did, unfortunately. And it wasn't until King Charles, spoke to the Italian Parliament just recently in April, that any senior British person had ever even said thank you to those Italians for what they had done. But some of them, as I say, did get small chunks of compensation. And what is really exciting, Paul, is that all the files, 60,000 files about Italians who helped escapers, still exist. They're in the American National Archive at Maryland, just outside Washington. And I've seen those files. I've read some of them. I mean, amazing sort of handwritten claims, heart-rending stories of losses suffered by the Italians. Little chits signed by the POWs. Giovanni gave me a meal. Boy, did it taste good. Sort of scribbled on the back of a fag packet or a serviette. And we've just done a deal with the American Archives to digitize and make available online the first 100 boxes of these files. There are 900 boxes altogether. 100 of them are being digitized now, virtually as we speak. And we're hoping to persuade the National Archive in the States to, over time, digitize the rest of them, because then there will be a rabbit hole to beat all rabbit holes. Endless, exciting stories of what I think is the greatest escape of the war. I mean, you know, we're talking about tens of thousands of Brits and Americans had a chance to get away. Some of them, about 10,000, actually did get home. So it's the greatest, it's the biggest escape of the war. But also it is the most incredible story of kindness to strangers. People risking their lives to help complete strangers, former enemies. It's an amazing story, and that's what the Monte San Martino Trust exists to commemorate and celebrate, and hopefully a story that will be alive for many decades to come.
Mm. Well, I mean, it's been an absolute pleasure listening to you, and I have one more question for you. So we've talked about your father, we've talked about the trust, we've talked about the archives, we've talked about the fact the viewers will be able to. Several people have bought copies while they've been listening to this, so there's a little bit of
Thank you very much. All the money goes to the Monte San Martino Trust.
It all goes to the trust there. But the one thing it's a kind of a trite interviewer's question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is that the thing I took away? Another thing I took away from your book, and I'm taking away from chatting to you now, is that in many ways the biggest beneficiary of this project has been you yourself and your children. In that, it seems to me that you got to know your father in a way different that added to the actual relationship you had with him as a father. You filled in gaps you didn't know you hadn't filled because you didn't know those gaps were there. So what's it been like for you to go through this process and rediscover your father?
Well, he was just my father. He was a rather quiet, pretty humble man. He ran a small building company in Worcester Park in Surrey. You know, didn't do great things after the war. He just liked a quiet life, actually. He liked his pipe and his slippers and the TV and, you know, having the family around him. And as I say, he never talked about the war. I think as a teenager, I probably thought he was a bit dull. And, you know, but thinking back, you know, of course, Paul, I kick myself every day that I didn't ask him. But when I think back, I mean, what would I have asked him? I didn't know anything about the war when I was 15. I wouldn't have known what to ask him, I don't think. And then all of a sudden, he was dead.
Yeah.
But this research that I've done and the chance I had to write the book and follow his extraordinary World War II journey, it's been the experience of my life. I mean, I've been lucky. I've got a lovely family. I've done some interesting jobs. But by far and away, the thing I am most proud of is this journey round my father that I did a few years ago, and the chance that it gave me to really understand what a special man he was and how special were the tens of hundreds of thousands of others who fought with him for what they believed in. And wow, am I glad I really understand about that now.
Well, as I said before, it's been absolutely delightful talking to you. I'm so glad I came to the conference and met you at that little soiree before the actual event itself. And I'll hold up my copy again there, folks. So there's my copy that Nick kindly signed for me. But say visit the trust, make a donation there, buy the book from Pen and Sword or your favorite bookstore, and people have requested in their dozens to invite you back for either a prequel or a sequel or whatever the combination of prequel and sequel is. But obviously, this is the key part of the story. It's the bit with the Italian cooperation. It's been with that forging of links and the creation of the trust. But that doesn't mean we don't want to have you come back and fill in the gaps. So if you'd be happy to, we'll arrange that sometime in the future. But Nick, I knew it'd be a great one, this one, and it has been fantastic talking to you.
I've loved it, Paul. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And do support the Monte San Martino Trust. It's a way of keeping alive one of many, many special war stories that will die out as our generation passes on to the next. So the more we can do to keep them alive, the better. Well done, you, Paul, for what you do with World War II TV, because you are also playing a part in keeping these stories alive.
Well, thank you. Definitely. I appreciate all the support we get from the viewers. So that's it, folks. Click like and subscribe. Buy my guest books. Tomorrow, we are back into the German-Soviet War series with a rather upsetting but important show about the Holocaust in Latvia in 1941 with Ed Westerman, who was on a few years ago talking about the effect of alcohol on the Third Reich in World War II. So I'm looking forward to speaking to Ed. Then we've got more shows coming your way too on Friday. Anyway, as always, I'll see you again tomorrow. In the meantime, this is Paul Woodad for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers, everybody. Bye.